Welcome to the Very Liberal podcast with me, Lib Dems,
And me, Mark Oaten,
where we review the world as it seems to us from a liberal perspective, at least a liberal perspective as far as I'm concerned, Mark.
and me, same old joke every time. Let's get on with the show.
I'm not joking.
You are.
No, I was talking about you. I was talking about you, somebody else, and I said you'd become less liberal. That's what I think these days. Anyway, what do you want to talk about? Party conferences, I suppose.
Yeah, party conferences, I've got some memories, and I'm sure you've got some memories. And, what have the parties got to do at these conferences? How have they performed? What will Reform do moving on from their conference? What do they need to do to become a national party? There's Keir Starmer, his clothes. There's my obsession at the moment about shops selling Christmas decorations. I've got so much to talk about, so let's crack on.
And maybe we'll talk about the Channel crossings as well. I think you and I have a different view on that, but people are dying. Something needs to be done. So let's start with party conferences. For those who don't understand, every year the big parties have a conference where the great and the good get together with the workers, and it's meant to be about public relations stunt, and policies meant to be made, and they're meant to be on television. Broadly speaking, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, and the Conservatives, or as I like to call them, the Uni Party, Mark, they all have their conferences in September. But Reform UK, they're the new kids on the block. They have a conference as well. Did you go to the Lib Dem conference this year, Mark?
Unfortunately, no. I was in Finland, Helsinki, being shown how the Finns deal with all of their political issues in a sauna, believe it or not. I mean, literally every single dispute that they have, business-wise or politically, the solution is to go into the sauna. Quite remarkable. But that's another story.
You're going to end up in the diary columns for saying that, Mark.
I know the sauna wasn't on. They just showed me where it happens.
That's your story, and you're sticking to it. Yeah,
absolutely. Sure. I wasn't sticking to anything else, I can assure you.
Ah, too much information, Mark.
Exactly.
Too much information. I didn't go to the party
conference. I mean, I went to hundreds, loads and loads of them. It's tough when you're an MP, particularly the better known you get in the party. Everybody wants to work with you. You're speaking at literally hundreds of fringes. Your lunchtime is taken rushing from one event to the other. You may have a keynote speech, and then it comes to the really dangerous zone, which is the bar in the evening when everyone wants to buy you a drink. And the journalists, of course, what they really want to do is to buy you lots of drinks so they can get you drunk and get some good gossip for their diary columns.
That never happened to me. I used to go to bed at about 9 o'clock in the evening. That's my story, and I'm sticking to that. Yes, you're right, though.
Say a bit about the bars in the different hotels, whether you're in Blackpool, Brighton, or Bournemouth. They always used to say that of all of the parties, the Lib Dems were the biggest drinkers. That was what the feedback was. But I used to go to some. I mean, the journalists were the worst. I remember going to one party in the bedroom of a senior part. Well, it was the leader of the party. Let's be honest about it. And there were all the journalists, lobby journalists there. And one of the key national journalists came out of the toilet with the toilet seat round his head. He was so drunk. He'd been taking drugs in the toilet. I mean, they talk about the MPs behaving badly, but when you see the lobby correspondents get together at party conference, they can really use their expenses accounts.
It's absolute hypocrisy. I completely agree. They sanctimoniously report the questionable behavior as they see it, or they claim it to be, of the politicians, but they're up to it themselves. I won't name him, but there's a senior a BBC journalist or reporter on television who got up to some hanky-panky with the researcher in the room they were using for radio, not realizing that the camera was still live. I'll tell you after we finish this who it was. I can't be bothered with all the trouble that I'll get if I report it now. But you're right. And returning to what you said about the bars are actually important in one sense. It's when the MPs do talk to the activists, and it is kind of a motivating thing. I've been to all Labour, Lib Dem, Conservative conferences in different guises, and I would say the Lib Dems were more intense than everyone else, perhaps because they're a bit more depressed.
I don't know. I mean, or then maybe they just like a good time because they're genuine liberals, Lembit. But I remember my worst experience. I'd stayed up all night in the bars chatting to all sorts of people. And I was due on the Today program at 7 o'clock. And they had a remote studio in the conference center. And I got into the studio. I had to throw up in the bin in the corner. It was so embarrassing. It was a really humiliating experience. I'm not proud of myself. But you know what? There was a sense of release also. It's a high-pressure job as a politician. And there was a sort of sense in which after you've done a day of intense meetings and performance during party conference, you just needed that drink to relax. I'm not saying it's the right thing, but it's the reality. That's what happened. But let's talk politics.
Just one thing, just to say about the hypocrisy of it, though. At the end of the day, politicians are very high octane people, and they tend to do high octane everything that normal people do, but even more of it. And let's be honest, there's all kinds of shenanigans that goes on in all the party conferences. It never really bothered me particularly, but it was just a rich seam of stories. One of my members of staff, whose nickname was Short Pig for various reasons, he was walking around like this on one occasion, and the journalist said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, if I do this, there are two of you." He's walking around like this. How do you think that?
Go on. We could go on and on about stories and
what do you
taxi
think?
What? Go on.
Oh yeah, the taxi drivers. Yeah, they were gossips, terrible gossips. But let's gossip about the Lib Dems. Where are they? They got 72 MPs and they hardly got any coverage.
And this is the issue. And I am struggling now because having performed so well to get those MPs, what is their purpose now? Are they trying to become the official opposition and take on the Conservatives? Are they trying to be serious opposition to the Labour government? I think Ed Davey tried to set that out this week. I think he talked about the issues where they were going to tackle the Labour Party, but they were the same kind of issues. They were talking about sewage and the NHS. I'd like to hear them more vocally talking about the winter fuel allowance issue. That is one I think the party needs to own, but they allowed the Conservatives to have a little bit of run of that. He set up, however, a shadow cabinet. Maybe it takes time. Maybe it takes time for these 72 new MPs to find their feet. But I want to see more action and less stunts coming through.
Oh, well, you finally admit all these months later that Davey ran a crap general election campaign.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying now is the time for political action, seriously getting people on Question Time, on the State programme, taking on the government, challenging them, putting down motions in Parliament. The time for arriving at conferences on ski jets and those stunts is over now.
But he's still doing it. Or at least I didn't see anything profound. I saw a little bit of coverage in mainstream media, but when it's compared to when you and I were members of Parliament, we got tons of coverage before even the party was in that failures coalition led by the worst leader in the history of the party. By your own survey, that's Nick Clegg came bottom in your survey. So I'm not having any lessons about Nick Clegg from you anymore. But I would have thought that the Lib Dems could have done well. There's one story I saw. Apparently they banned Liberal Voice for Women or a group like that because it could be offensive because they think women are women and men are men. Is that what the party's come to? Whatever happened to free speech? Whatever happened to, wait for it, liberalism?
Well, look, on that, we totally agree. I don't want nanny state. I don't want to see the party going down that particular direction. However, let's move on because there's one party that did capture the headlines, and that is Reform. And this for them is a critical point. They've made the breakthrough, albeit with a few number of MPs. They had a very good election campaign. They scored really highly on the national share of the vote. I think everybody acknowledges now the challenge for them is how do they become an activist-based party? Because what the Liberal Democrats did with less popular vote is get 72 seats. Now, can Reform do that? How do they use a party conference to create that infrastructure? And is Lembit, Nigel Farage, actually a barrier to that because he's a one-man show?
I wouldn't say he's a barrier, but it was interesting what he said to the run-up to their conference. And I've got something to say about their venue too. He said he was going to relinquish control. Now, I know from insider sources what he means by that. They're talking about setting up a party structure. I spoke with Anne Widdecombe, who's a senior representative, former Conservative minister, of course, but senior representative of Reform, very eloquently explaining that they're serious about building an on-the-ground movement. But you know as well as I do, we've both done this, it's an incredibly difficult job. And I'm not necessarily convinced that the best thing that they ever did was get rid of some of their generals, people who were instrumental in their comparative voter success in the general election. So the question that remains, even with their conference at Birmingham and everything else, is how do they convert that Reform conference, which hasn't really got that much coverage, let's be honest, into actual votes and into actual people leafleting on the ground? Can they do that? Or is this an air war party rather than a ground war party, to use the kind of parlance we remember from our days in Parliament?
Well, I think they're running against a tide slightly if they want to try and create ground war politics, because I know from my experience during this general election working with the Lib Dems that the ground war was quite hard to organise, because these days people don't want to stuff leaflets through letterbox. These days, as people move more to social media, to instant political reaction on X and Instagram, actually the idea of putting leaflets through doors is something which could be disappearing. So there's a paradox here for the Reform. Actually, politics is moving much more to the social media, the air war. It's moving to that kind of area. But for them to create a national base is going to be very hard, because actually for all the political parties, having that grassroots base is becoming tougher and tougher. It's all about social media and the air war.
I suspect that you're right. I haven't thought about this before, Mark. I've finally learned something from you. No offense. And it could be this, at the old
18
parties,
episodes in and you finally learned something, Lembit.
Yeah,
you need to just listen.
Finally learned something. But the thing I've learned is very important. It could be that the old parties have a built-in advantage because they still have a historical ground base. And it might be extremely difficult for Reform UK to do that. There's another group called the Together Association. They had their big jamboree on Friday, the 20th of September. They've tried to do this as well. They've got lots of able people, but somehow they never really made the impact in the general election that they thought they would. I didn't think they would as well. So it could be Reform UK have to depend, as you say, it's an interesting point, on the air war. And for that, Nigel Farage is good, but he himself has now said he's going to try to emulate the other parties. I still think that he probably has to do it in order to win an election. As you well know, you big it up in a set of target seats. That's the way he breaks through from 5. But can he get to 326? He wants to be the next prime minister. You're not going to do that unless you've got tens of thousands of people delivering leaflets.
Maybe the compromise here is that the air war is actually an air war in around 50 seats. So what you do is you take the techniques of air war, but you minimize it down to a number of regions and area and try and create as much air traffic noise as you possibly can in those areas. But let's move on to wherever the next conference is, and that is the Conservatives, because we're going to have a beauty contest. The 4 candidates that have finally gone through the process of the parliamentary selection appear at a beauty contest. And if this wasn't more complicated, they then have to get narrowed down to 3 and then to 2. And then there's another beauty contest with all of the party members voting on it in November. It's a very long process. It's going to dominate their conference. But, Lembit, is it clever? Because rather than focusing on the failure and the past of what just happened to them, losing that election, they're able, maybe if they get this right, to spin it and talk about the future with these 4 potential candidates.
It's like they've got a suspended sentence. They did terribly, worst they've ever done in a general election, but everyone seems to have moved on from it. And you're right. I suspect partly, we'll talk about Keir Starmer later, I'm sure, partly because of Labour's failures, the Tories might be playing it long and playing it smart. I don't really think any of the Conservative candidates are that impressive. Maybe we'll talk about that in another podcast. But in terms of wanting headlines, this is, to quote a famous Tory, oven-ready news, because they're going to be able to talk about this rather turgid leadership election right through to essentially the end of the year when we get to the silly season.
I mean, it's all set up, wasn't it, after that election defeat for a load of infighting, the party having big divisions. Should it be trying to move back to the centre to win back those liberal Democrat voters, or should it be moving to the right to try and stop the reform surge? There's a real dilemma for the party, a real row and argument to be had. However, they seem to have dodged that argument by just having the news talk about these 4 candidates. I think it's potentially smart. However, underlying it, they need to have this argument. They need to decide what they're going to do, because they cannot take on both reform and the Liberal Democrats at the same time. It is not possible. There is no common ground which allows them to do both of that. So whoever becomes leader, and we will talk about it in the next pod, has got somehow to decide the direction of the party. It's a huge challenge for them.
At time of broadcasting, we haven't really seen the fallout from the Labour conference. So let's leave that to the next time. But let's talk about Keir Starmer himself, who goes into his conference in rather a sticky situation. This freebie alert, the fact he's earning £400,000 a year, it all looks terrible for a man who pretends to have Labour Party credentials. Let me have a whinge about this. Turns out he's been getting free hospitality at Arsenal. And he says, well, it's because I want to save the public money by not picking the stalls. Hang on a sec. What are you paying for your ticket then in the box? What's stopping you from paying 1,500 quid, which I think would be his fair share if there's 6 people, or £1,000 if it's like 8 of them or 10 of them? What's stopping you from paying anything? And this is what people are getting really sick of now, because he just looks like he's one of those pigs from Animal Farm, George Orwell's book, with his nose in the trough. And that's not going to please even the tiny number of people who voted for him.
I mean, look, we started off, I think, quite well. I believe that, and I know we fundamentally disagree on this, but in terms of political response to the riots, he killed those riots off within 24, 48 hours. He started off well because he was on his home territory. He was dealing with law and order. He was dealing with criminals and offence and all of those issues. Since then, it has been one own goal after the other. The winter fuel payments is going to be a real nail in his coffin, in my judgment. He's going to have to reverse that because the sense of disquiet around that, particularly as we get towards a cold winter, is going to be huge. This isn't going away. But then you've got the silly small mistakes, like having Sue Gray and turning out that she's getting paid more than the Prime Minister, taking the hospitality at Arsenal. If it had been Watford, I'd have had no issue about it at all. And then, of course, it turns out he's been getting freebies in terms of what he dresses like. I have a bit of sympathy there. If, you think about the time that the Conservatives used to attack Michael Foot for dressing in his donkey jacket at the Cenotaph. We do want our Prime Minister to look smart. But what's wrong with Zara Next or M&S, for goodness sake? Do you really have to spend out on expensive suits?
I'll tell you what's creepy about it. Who comes home, finds his wife's just got a whole bunch of clothes from a millionaire, and says, all right, crack on. I'm off to the football. This is the thing. It's so awkward. So he hasn't got enough money. He's taking 300 quid from 10 million pensioners each every year, but he hasn't got enough money on his 400 grand a year income, whatever his wife earns, to buy her clothes. It's disgusting.
Remember how much they attacked Rishi Sunak for being wealthy and being out of touch, and it's falling down the same trap. Look, I have no issue with politicians having private wealth and income. That's entirely their business. But I do have an issue around bad political judgment. And I think taking that hospitality at Arsenal, taking those clothes, was bad political judgment. If he can make it about relatively small issues like that, he can also have bad judgment about the bigger issues. And I think that's one of the worrying signs moving forward for this Premiership. It is a very short honeymoon. And my goodness, it's allowing the tourists to get back into the game. That's right. That's where the Lib Dems need to step up to stop that happening.
Lib Dems aren't going to do it under Ed Davey, I don't think. Don't dislike the guys, but he just isn't doing anything with the firepower he's got. But returning to Keir Starmer, he looks like a hypocrite. He feels like a hypocrite. That's the problem we've got here, because you don't expect a Labour MP who is the son of a tool maker to actually do this and then fail to declare it. That's the other thing. It looked like he was trying to cover it up. Meanwhile, he's still getting it in the neck for things like apparently a complete absence of policy when it comes to the Channel crossings, which are still killing people. Though I have to say, most people are just angry about the Channel crossings, I think.
I mean, I trouble with this because my liberal side, my welcoming side, my wanting to protect individuals who are on persecution makes me want to be as welcoming as I possibly can. However, there are people dying, and this has to be resolved. And I think we've got to the point now where most ordinary people think, look, it's a small channel. It's 26 miles between the French police, the UK police, the French Navy, the UK Navy. Have we not got the capability and power to stop these boats from a military perspective? Because it's about saving lives now. Irrespective of your views on immigration, this is purely, in my view, a military operation to stop lives being lost. Why can't we stop this? It is ridiculous.
If they'd used the police, and this is where you and I disagree, if they used the police who oppressed mainly peaceful protesters who didn't like immigration policy to actually stand on the coast near Dover, they wouldn't even be getting in because they could be sent back straight away. I have to say that Starmer has completely and utterly failed this country when it comes to migration policy. And I say that as a son of immigrants who came in here understanding that the idea was to be grateful, to be accepted and assimilate, to become part of the culture that's accepted you and do whatever your other cultural things are, but in private, really. Celebrate Christmas on a different day and that kind of thing. It doesn't matter to you that I celebrate Christmas on the 24th of December, as long as they don't make you do the same thing. Starmer is failing on policy. And I have to say, one of the huge running sores this year has been migration policy. You might be right, by the way. If you add all this together, he could really, really be stumbling in terms of his premiership now. And I just have to throw this in as well. Al Fayed from Harrods, Jimmy Savile from the BBC, neither of them even went to court when he was, as he keeps telling us, the Director of Public Prosecutions. That is, I would predict, a looming problem, which is really going to hit him in the face in the near future.
Well, look, we'll look at Keir Starmer in much more detail when we analyse the Labour Party conference, but the knives are soon going to be out, and I'll be interesting to see whether during that party conference there aren't some trade union leaders or some backbench Labour MPs that start to express their disquiet.
Yeah, I don't think I agree. And some people have said to me he'll be finished soon, but I don't think it'll all be over by Christmas for him. I think that he's.
Will you stop? You've mentioned Christmas twice now. Will you? You're pressing a button with me because I've just. The button that says, I've just been over to the garden centre to get my hot chocolate. They're putting the bloody Christmas decorations up already.
What?
The winter bulbs were being displayed in the summertime. You can't get hold of a daffodil now. All you can get hold of is a fairy to put on the bloody top of the tree. It's ridiculous. It could still be summertime. I'm hanging on to the idea we might yet get a summer, and the garden centre and other shops are putting Christmas decorations up. I mean, it's ridiculous, don't you think?
Dream on about the weather. In terms of Christmas, there is no climate crisis. It's getting colder, I think. In terms of Christmas, I actually, for the second time today, I'm agreeing with you. I haven't seen any Christmas decorations. I thought you were going to say you didn't think that our secular country should support Christmas because it might offend some people. But actually, you're saying a good thing. It's too early for Christmas. Nothing is going to convince me that putting Christmas decorations in at the beginning of autumn makes sense. Who would have thought it? Mark, we actually agree on that. Is it illiberal? No. I just won't buy anything from a place. Unlike you, I won't buy anything in a place that's got Christmas decorations up. And I won't do it till the end of October.
It's all a load of balls as far as I'm concerned. And on that note, because we've agreed, I think we should probably draw this pod to an end before we start disagreeing again, don't you?
If you want to find out more, go to our location there. You'll see it on the screen. We'll be back next time, I'd imagine, to review in more detail what happened to Keir Starmer at his conference and whether he's had any more freebies that he hadn't told us about and who's paying for his wife's clothes. But I'm going to stop there. I'm Lib Dems.
And I'm Mark Oaten.
And this was the Very Liberal Podcast. See you soon.